question should really be who holds a copy or the original of my keys.
Hey everyone, welcome back to another Kitecast episode. I'm your host for today's show, Patrick Spencer. Joining me is my colleague across the pond, Rick Goud. He is our Chief Innovation Officer at Kiteworks. Rick, thanks for making time to speak to me today.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it, Patrick.
Well, for anyone who's been watching our podcast, you'll know that Rick and I did a session, it's been, 4 or 5 months ago, somewhere in that.
Probably so.
On the same topic on data sovereignty, but needless to say, one, things have changed since then, and two, we just released our brand new report on data sovereignty, which has a lot of interesting findings, particularly from the perspective of the Europeans and the Middle East and Canada. And we're going to be honing in on some of the findings in the report during today's call. If you're interested in a full copy of the report, we do not gate them. You don't have to provide your registration details in order to read it. You can simply go to kiteworks.com and search for Data Sovereignty Report 2026, and it'll pop up and you can take a look at it, as well as some of the blog posts that we've written on some of the findings. So Rick, let's do a quick introduction for our audience before we dive into the details. He, as I mentioned, is our Chief Innovation Officer, where he leads innovation strategy for secure, compliant digital communications and content governance. He previously co-founded Ziffer, a secure digital communications platform, which Kiteworks acquired back in 2025. And he holds a PhD in medical informatics. Talking to a smart guy here, obviously. His path into data sovereignty started 6 years ago as a healthcare strategy consultant at Gupta Strategist, where he saw firsthand the risk of sharing highly sensitive data through insecure channels. Today, he's recognized as a European data sovereignty and privacy expert. He's a frequent speaker on operationalizing strong data protection without sacrificing productivity. So, Rick, I'm looking forward to this conversation, as I'm sure our audience is.
Likewise, and thanks for the impressive intro, Patrick.
Oh, thanks to AI, as often is the case, right? So we are talking, as I mentioned, about our annual, this will be our first report, but we're planning to do it annually because it is certainly a salient topic in today's marketplace, the 2026 Data Security Compliance Report. We surveyed almost 300 professionals across Canada, the Middle East, and Europe, 3 different regions that are navigating very different data sovereignty realities today. The central finding in the report, from my perspective anyway, we'll see if Rick agrees, is a striking paradox at roughly 80%, almost certainly a vast majority of the respondents feel well informed about data sovereignty requirements, yet 1 in 3 said they experienced a data sovereignty related incident in the last 12 months. The report covers a full spectrum from awareness and incident rates to AI governance, compliance costs, 2-year planning outlooks, cross-analysis between the different regions, industry, role, organization size. It makes a compelling case, as we're going to discuss today, that data sovereignty is shifting from a compliance checkbox to a competitive differentiator. And that gap between stated awareness and provable control is where the real risk lies, in our opinion. So, Rick, let's dive into the report. The first thing, as I mentioned, awareness is high. 80% say they're well informed. They understand data sovereignty, yet, as often is the case with cybersecurity or compliance related issues, 1 in 3 said they had a data sovereignty incident last year. Why do you think there's such a gap here?
Yeah, well, first, I think I want to challenge the fact that people are well informed. So I certainly agree that especially in Europe, so I can talk about the European context a lot because I'm from Europe. And if you would have told me 2 years ago that I would be talking every day about data sovereignty, I would have called you crazy. But that is the reality we do live in nowadays. I do see that everybody is aware. I do not meet any stakeholder that does not talk about digital sovereignty, and even the people that are not in IT, they often ask me, what do I think about the US Cloud Act, etc. However, the level to which people are really informed is sometimes a little bit less than they pretend to be, or at least they think they're well informed, and to some extent it is, but it's based on a narrow source. So typically people think they know what sovereignty means, and that then means, hey, that if I host my data on a US hyperscaler, then under Cloud Act, and if I buy something from a local vendor, then suddenly I am sovereign. Well, that is absolutely not true. That's a very narrow definition of sovereignty on the one hand, and B, it's factually untrue, because Cloud Act, it does not matter where your data resides, because as the report also states, there's an interesting OVSH case where indeed data stored in France had to be given to another country because of the fact, or despite the fact it was stored in France. Even data stored on European clouds can fall under Cloud Act or any other legislation. So the real location doesn't matter. It matters how you actually protect and control it. So a lot of people think they are aware. Typically they are not, or they have a very narrow specific definition that is typically not sovereignty, how you should look at it.
So it's no surprise probably to you, based on what you just said, that 1 in 3 experienced a data sovereignty incident last year because of the rationale that you just provided.
Yeah, totally. And also, it sometimes even is the opposite, right? That people think, oh, I will get an open source tool that is made in Europe, and then I am sovereign, quote, quote. But yeah, typically those tools were not per se built for security, and while actually making sure that sensitive information does not get in the wrong person's hands. That is actually what you want to accomplish when you look at sovereignty. Then where your data is located and where the software is developed is only a very small piece, because you can have very European software that you host on your own data center. But if the security is not up to the standards, then every state actor or every third party can access your data, which is the opposite of sovereignty. So It is a very complex, multi-dimensional model that every company for themselves should assess, what do I consider to be important in sovereignty, and just create a framework for themselves on how they want to internally look at their software. And then you will find out that who built the software is only a very small piece of the puzzle, and it is more of who controls it, who has the keys to the kingdom. And if you put that central, then typically you're much more sovereign than where was my software built.
Interesting. Now, the survey, we looked at 3 different regions: Canada, Europe, and the Middle East. And then we published the big report, but we also, for whatever it's worth to our audience, you have individual reports. They're shorter. They're like 6 pages or so each. One on Canada, one on Europe, and one on the Middle East. When you look at these 3 regions, there's similarities, but there's also a lot of differences as well. Rick, what's your perspective of the findings on this front?
Yeah. So actually, I think that Canada and Europe are actually quite alike, so to say. I think Middle East is a little bit different. If you look at Europe and Canada, they were just used to using a lot of US hyperscalers, and now suddenly they were talking about moving away. However, from a feature parity perspective, that is quite a challenge, because it's actually very hard to find good alternatives for the comprehensive set of functionalities that Microsoft 365 or Google offers. While if you look at the Middle East, they were already used to trying to buy local, use local software. They already started with sovereignty more in mind than Canada and Europe, which moved all to the cloud 2 or 3 years ago, and now suddenly want to move back. So I think that is an interesting paradigm shift between those 2 different regions, so to say.
Well, there's also another finding in it that along the lines of what you were speaking, where the Middle East reports a 44% incident rate, which is almost double Canada's, which was at 23%, despite, to your point, saying with 93%, not 80%, but 93% saying regulations directly impact them. Is this a maturity problem? Is it a speed of regulation? Both, or something else? What's causing this difference between the regions?
Actually, I think a maturity problem, right? Because so we in Europe especially and also in Canada, are talking a lot about sovereignty and then how can we move away from US hyperscalers. Well, if you look at ISO 27001 and if you look at all legislation, you have to take a risk-based approach, saying, okay, what are my real risks? And then, of course, you should start with the highest risk and mitigate that. If you look at that scale, the real quote-unquote risk of a sovereignty incident with US hyperscalers is not per se that big. It is I think a very good evolvement that people want to control the keys of the kingdom and want to possess their own data. But typically there are not too many incidents yet historically. If you look at the transparency reports that AWS and Azure published, close to 0 times, or most vendors even 0 times ever had to give away their data. So if you use those hyperscalers, there were not that many sovereignty incidents really. But by, of course, moving away and using, well, more local software that has not been around for that long and has not been extensively stress tested for security, the likelihood of some security incidents that actually impact your sovereignty because people get hold of your data is much
higher,
much bigger. So I think it is an interesting paradigm shift that people want to move away from non-local or non-regional vendors. But that comes with a majority squeeze that will certainly result in a couple of data leaks in the months to years to come, because you see people moving software that say they are secure, and everybody, of course, say they are secure, but the checks and balances and the certifications do not match the claims, to say the least.
Yep. Now, you talked a bit about the hyperscalers. There's an interesting finding in regards to Europe and hyperscalers. Europe, as our audience probably knows, they're pursuing this GLOCAL, G-L-O-C-A-L, for those who are listening and can't understand my Midwest English. But they're pursuing this GLOCAL model rather than abandoning hyperscalers. Only 4%, based on our findings in the report, say they're going to go fully local. Smart pragmatism from your perspective, or is this a vulnerability?
Yeah, it's pragmatism and realism. Yeah, because once you get used to all the Microsoft 365 or so functionalities and all the Azure managed services, it is very hard to get local equivalents. And again, there's a strategic agenda to stimulate the development of the softwares across Europe, but that certainly will take another 4 to whatever years to get to a certain maturity level. So I think it's just needs pragmatism/realism. For a lot of services, you unfortunately have to stay with those hyperscalers, but where you can, whether it's for secure data exchange, which we of course know all about, there are some point solutions that you can put on top of the European of the US hyperscalers to make it much more secure. But abandoning them as a whole is just not realistic for most use cases. And then people say, oh, but I go to Nextcloud or I go to something else. Again, most of those providers that try to do it will run into a lot of feature gaps and a lot of compliancy and security gaps. So I think most, certainly governments and private institutions that I see, they are just realistic that moving away will be a long-term play. On the short-term, US hyperscalers is the only way forward, and indeed use a use case by use case based approach to slowly move away from the dependence.
All right, well, let's jump back across the pond to Canada, and I'm going to ask a Canadian question to a guy in the Netherlands. How's that? So the report found that 40% of Canadian respondents flagged changes to Canadian and U.S. data sharing as their top concern. If you're a Canadian enterprise, how worried should you be about your dependency on U.S. headquartered providers? Is this a legitimate concern?
So, yes and no. So there are 2 aspects, right? So I think the shift, and again in Canada, the shift is actually quite similar to Europe, where we had a trusted partner in the U.S. that over the last 1 year shifted to a realistic, okay, let's not put our eggs all in one basket and we should be self-proficient. and the same goes for Canada. There's of course a difference between collaborating with US softwares and knowing that you hold the keys to your own kingdom versus giving the keys totally away to somebody else. And I think that is the balance that people are now trying to find. How can you use the best of both worlds, because there is a lot of unique skill in the US in terms of software development, security, and hyperscalers. But how can you use that power while making sure that you do not expose yourself to all kinds of risks? And then encryption, where you hold your keys, is typically a measure that people then increasingly consider on top of the US-based software to make sure that indeed you leverage the benefit of those hyperscalers while not giving your keys to the kingdom away to whoever is in the house.
Whoever asks. Well, I wrote a Substack article, I think it was last week. It'll be several weeks old by the time this podcast comes out. But there was the FBI instance where they asked, I forgot what entity it was, for their keys, and they handed it over to the FBI. It was a Microsoft-related instance where they asked and they had to hand over their keys. So that key management question is particularly important when you're considering your cloud providers too.
Totally right, and that's part of the sovereignty that a lot of people typically ask: do you guys encrypt? I hope everybody's answer nowadays is yes, but the question should really be who holds a copy or the original of my keys. And if you look at the typical hyperscalers, their service is built on having access to your data because then they can provide advanced search functionalities, all kinds of indexation, alerting. And that is contradictory indeed with Cloud Act, where if somebody wants and knocks on the door, then technically they have the possession of the keys and are forced to hand it over. So finding a way that you make sure that, again, you have your keys and not your vendor is the only way to solve the problem. And maybe we can post that as a part of the podcast or so, Patrick, because actually that in the Netherlands, so the country where I come from, we have the National Cybersecurity Center. And actually already 3 years ago or so, they let a renowned law firm investigate how can in Europe we protect ourselves from Cloud Act. And basically their conclusion was there is only really one way, is to make sure that you hold the keys and not any vendor, because by not having a possession of your keys, the vendor can deny the fact that they have control over the data, which means that they do not have to or cannot give the data to whatever subpoena or whatever government wants to have access to your data. So encryption is really key.
Yep. No pun intended, right?
No.
Now, any conversation of cybersecurity and compliance, it would be remiss without a discussion of, people. Even with AI, it still comes back to a people issue quite often. And there sort of is a people problem that was raised in the survey. We found that 63% of CISOs said they're very well informed, while from an IT management standpoint, the largest group of respondents said they're doing well at 41%. That's a pretty significant difference when you think of, particularly with our surveys, 41% compared to 63%. So, when you compare these two, why is there a real world gap between the executive cybersecurity suite, the CISOs, and the IT managers who are managing it day to day?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I, to be honest, think it is really a knowledge gap. In practice, I see that the percentages that we see respondents reporting indeed is based on their current perception of what sovereignty and what control is. I think if you look at IT, the people that work day to day with the systems, they see how challenging it actually is to really be sovereign. On paper, you can of course make everything work and everything look sovereign. In practice, having to indeed migrate, having to make sure that everything still works, that continuity is there. That is a really big challenge. Again, everybody is talking about moving away, but I've rarely seen experiments be successful. And of course, from the outside, I do hear some people saying it was awesome, but if you then talk to people actually using the system, it is typically quite painful, because you do have to have a shift using tool A to tool B. changing people behavior is typically the most difficult thing to do. We are habitual people that are used to something, and then changing is killing for productivity, and that hurts in practice on an IT.
Well, I think the C-suite, often, even with my employees, our perception of, oh, it's happening, it works, but we don't understand the minutia, the detail that actually needs to happen in order for it to occur successfully. Because it just happens below us. We assume it's seamless when that really isn't the case. Now, that's internal when we're talking about internal challenges around data sovereignty. How about third parties, right? This is an interesting question that we posed to our survey respondents. You found that third-party compliance failures tied as the most common incident type at 17%. How much of data sovereignty is a vendor management problem with third parties versus other issues that we talked about in the report?
Well, I think third party is essential, right? Because so typically you would rely on your vendors to make sure you are sovereign, and maybe a sidestep for those readers, and maybe we can also post it as part of the podcast. The European Committee or the EU, they published a sovereignty framework in October, where indeed they provide a framework of 7 or so dimensions of sovereignty. And one of the important dimensions is actually the supply chain part of sovereignty, because you can claim to be sovereign if you develop something in Europe or Canada, but a lot of those software use actually software as part of their own software that is then still developed in the US, that they do not have version control over, that does have a perpetual license, etc. So there is no software engineer that builds all the software themselves. And so understanding those dependencies is very important. And that's why you see the importance of a SOC 2 Type 2, publishing the SBOM, where you have to be transparent on what third-party tools are using. That is becoming increasingly important, but that also comes with a challenge, because it's not easy to swap out component A for component B if it's ingrained in your software. That is typically where the in-compliance comes from. You might be developed in Europe or in Canada or the Middle East, but by using unsovereign components doesn't make you more sovereign.
All right. Well, any podcast that we do nowadays must include a question or two around AI. So we did, in our survey, for what it's worth, we did ask some AI questions. Probably has changed since we got the responses about 2 months ago. 21% of organizations said they're still developing their AI data policy with the EU AI Act already in effect, right? It's already in effect. And almost a quarter say we're not there yet. We don't even have an AI data policy in place. How much more time do you have if you're one of these 21% of the organizations? Are you in really bad shape? And how much longer do you have before you need to get this wrapped up and codified?
Yeah, great question. If anybody knows the answer, please come forward after this podcast, right? And
it depends on all the fines and penalties that are about to
exactly
come.
Right. And that is with Europe, where typically the US, you guys, if you say we need to be CMMC compliant, then typically there is a relative quick and stringent enforcement. In Europe, typically we tend to be a little bit slower. But especially with AI, I think companies have a big challenge, right? Because everybody understands the power that AI can bring in terms of workforce productivity. But on the other hand, you also want to make sure that indeed you do not expose your sensitive data to AI. But there are not that many tools that allow you to govern that control layer. How can you make sure that if somebody sends something to AI, that it does or does not comply to your policy? And that's actually a topic that we at Kiteworks are working very intense on, and we have some interesting solutions for. But it's hard to have a policy that basically says we can protect all our data, or technically you can't, and then the only solution is to ban the use of AI. But that will give you such a competitive disadvantage that most companies probably do not dare to do so. I do see that governments, by the way, I do see that governments have a policy: thou shalt not use ChatGPT or Claude or whoever. Mm-hmm. But you also then do see that they do not reap the benefits of the productivity gain that you can accomplish. So also there, it's probably a maturity play that probably over the next 9 to 12 months, you will see tools that do allow you to work with ChatGPT or Claude or Copilot while making sure that you only share the data that according to your compliance you should or can be shared with those tools.
Yeah.
But nowadays, realism is that those tools do not yet exist to the extent that they're usable, workable, etc. So it's an interesting balance between non-compliance or non-productivity. Pick your pick.
Yep. No, and that's actually my next question. So you've already answered part of it, but when we ask what type of AI strategy from a data sensitive standpoint do you deploy, and it's sort of a mixed approach, right? They're trying to straddle that fence as you just described, where you minimize the risk, but at the same time you don't hamstring the organization in terms of innovation. This mixed approach sounds good on paper, but how hard is it when you have a mixed approach? And do you really know where your data is and what type of data you have and who has access to it, who doesn't? Particularly when it comes to organizations, and many in our audience fall into this bucket, that cross various jurisdictions, right? They have operations in Canada, they have operations in the US, they have operations in Europe and Asia Pac and so forth. And there's different compliancy laws in place in all of them and different repercussions associated to non-compliance at the same time.
Yeah. So to be honest, I think this is a totally unsolved problem. I try to monitor a lot of startups and scale-ups that provide solutions for that. In Europe, I do not come across organizations that have solved this problem. I think indeed in the next 1 to 2 years, this will be the place for startups to try to provide solutions that do allow you to govern. Because again, where currently you might have 100 employees, in a couple of months or to a year time, you double the number of employees that are actually digital because they are agents. If you don't do that, then probably you'll shoot yourself in the foot. But that does need to come with the guardrails and the compliancy requirements that are required. And again, if somebody in this podcast says, I've nailed it, reach out to us, because then we can only learn from these best practices and spread the word. I've not seen that working. And again, at Kiteworks, we're working on awesome stuff related to it. But looking at the current state of play, I do not see any company that can really do what it tells you on paper.
Yeah. Yeah, very, very true. Now, we looked at the organizational size in regards to data sovereignty, compliance, the success, how often they actually are experiencing incidents from a data sovereignty standpoint. And we found that there's like a 15 to 25 point, depending on the question that we ask, difference between small organizations and large organizations, and probably not a huge surprise that large organizations are doing better than small organizations, just because they have probably more maturity when it comes to cybersecurity and data governance, but then they have a lot more resources at the same time.
Yeah, no, totally. I think especially the latter is important. For those smaller companies, they typically have to rely on their MSPs or so to provide that intelligence and that knowledge. And that is still underdeveloped as a service, so to say. So they just don't have the expertise nor the money, right? Because for those smaller companies, you do see that budget on AI probably exploded, but then they also still have budget for the governance. It's a fine balance. So it's totally not surprising. And I see that in practice that the bigger organizations have the expertise to at least work on it and feel that they are in control within the limitations of their power. Small companies, they just use the tools at hand and pray / hope that somebody else can help them solve the problem later down the road, but first want to reap the benefits of the productivity gain first.
Yeah, very, very true. Now, when we ask the question around, well, what's your top priority when it comes to data sovereignty compliance? It was automation. 53% cited it as one of their top 3 priorities. Not a big surprise. I mean, when we talk about AI, automation often percolates to the very top of the list, particularly as we've seen AI agentics introduced in the last year and a half. Where are your biggest wins if you're an organization and you're wanting to automate some of the compliance issues around data sovereignty?
Yeah. So I think so. Typically, your policy lives on paper, and you tried to implement it in practice, and whether you are able to prove that you really live up to the standard, probably with auditors you got away with some simple checks and balances. That you cannot permit yourself to do that anymore because before you know that agents will be using or sharing your data without your consent. And I think that is actually where typically organizations look at use cases like secure email, secure file transfer, file collaboration, which of course is the last mile for the problem to solve, but it is all about compliance and control. So first, I think the most important part is that you have to invest in this engine that no matter the channel, you have control over / you can protect your data, because if you do that well, that engine can also collect all the relevant logging data that then allows you to create those reports that do allow you to say or claim that you are or aren't compliant to HIPAA, CMMC, NIS2, DORA, wherever it may be. So that centralized engine that is basically your universal lens towards all your sharing of your data, including all logging, that can only be the first point you need or want to invest in, because otherwise things will explode. You need to have that centralized the policy decision point, as typically it's called in literature.
Yeah, very true. And maybe that's one of the answers to the next question that I'm about to ask you. You know, we're in an environment where it's becoming more mature. The technologies and the processes and the systems that organizations are putting into place. You know, and we're sort of shifting from this perception of we believe that we're compliant, right? Which makes the CEO happy sometimes.
Yeah.
To you got to prove it. We can actually prove that we're compliant. You know, and organizations are now being asked by their boards, by their C-suite, by the regulators, you know, to prove it. You know, if someone's asked on short notice, demonstrate that your AI usage is compliant with, you know, one of those regulations behind you on the board, for example. You know, how can you prove it? What's a mechanism that you can put into place that can get you from A to B as quickly as possible, and you can focus on business issues rather than keeping the regulators happy.
Yeah. So a couple of aspects. So I don't see it in practice, right? Again, you have to have this policy decision point that you put centralized in there that allows you to understand what is being collected, what you receive, and what you store. And it's not just about agents, right? That's my second point. It is also what companies have. And a typical example is, so again, I'm from the Netherlands. For the audience, we have around 17 million inhabitants in the Netherlands. But one of the biggest telcos, Odido, had a big data breach last week, where apparently for over 5 months' time, hackers were in their systems and they exfiltrated the data of a little over 8 million. So that's almost half of all the inhabitants in the Netherlands. And of course, that can happen to everybody. But what is or can happen, everybody's at risk to that to some extent. But what is interesting, that is a part of the data set that's been extracted that is now published on the dark web, because they didn't want to pay the fine or the ransom fine, so to say. It contains a lot of data from people that were no longer customers for a very long time. And according to their compliance on paper and on their website, the data should have already been deleted. And I think that's the general problem. People collect so much data, share so much data by humans, by AI, that the reality on paper just does not match the reality in practice. And again, only when you invest in those centralized data policy engines, policy decision points that allow you to add metadata to the files you collect to understand how long can or should I store this, who can we share this with, under what conditions, then you're only able to protect it well and to generate the reports automatically that you need to prove to the auditors that it's not just a paper reality, that it's a real reality. However, that adoption of those tools is still very much in its infancy, but I do expect that to have incredible growth over the next 12 months, Because again, otherwise, with all the AI being adopted also by the malicious parties, you will see that there will be more data leaks. And if then, again, the paper reality and the practical reality of how you manage and protect your own data does not match, probably then we will see the fines coming.
Interesting. You got me thinking, you have all this data that has retention policies associated with it, and you want to expire it as soon as possible because retaining it actually, as you just noted, incurs higher risk. Tagging it and understanding what kind of data you have, I would assume, is a starting point. We've had a couple announcements here at Kiteworks for those who've been watching the news with several different large data security posture management companies in the marketplace that do that discovery and the identification and tagging. But then Kiteworks sort of takes it the last mile where it's enforcement related as well. So I assume having the right DSPM in place is important so you understand what data you have, it's tagged appropriately and so forth. But then if you aren't actually enforcing it in terms of who it can be shared with and so forth, you incur additional risk. So you have to have both of your bases covered, right? You got to have the discovery and the tagging covered. You also got to have the enforcement in place at the same time.
Totally. Indeed, so where I was talking about data policy engine, policy decision point, whatever you like to call it, which is growing, but certainly not as fast as all DSPM vendors, because indeed that is the type of vendor that you're talking about, the data security posture management. And what those type of vendors indeed do is allow you to basically get a overview, a insight of where your sensitive data lies, what the properties are. So indeed you can say, but this type of data needs to be removed within X period of time. But again, it only provides you, let's say, with the Google Maps towards your sensitive data. But again, actually enforcing and applying those policies, preventing that sensitive information that should not be shared according to your policy is not really shared. That is typically where all of these DSPM vendors stop, because they help you to navigate your sensitive data, not to protect. And again, of course, it is a layered approach where first you have to know where your sensitive data is, and then put the controls in place and the engines in place that help you to allow and apply those policies that, again, you've written on paper, but now need to be enforced.
Yeah. Great point. All right, for our audience, as we take a step back from the report, what are one or two of the key takeaways that you think a CISO or a compliance leader needs to be aware of from the report findings?
Yeah, so I think that the most important thing is sovereignty is here and will stay here for the next couple of years. Do make sure that you adopt internally a framework that allows you to objectively measure for internal stakeholder purposes, but also for vendor comparisons on what you as a company find important, right? Because otherwise you will see yourself discussing sovereignty with some IT colleagues, with C-level suites, because everybody will use a different definition of sovereignty. Only if you adopt this framework that internally provides you with this language that allows you to understand each other, but also then to measure your vendors against, that will certainly make your life a lot easier, because of that. Everybody thinks they are aware and well informed. Practice is, it's not the case. A universal framework will help you in that transition.
Some great recommendations there. All right, one more question for you, then I promise we're finished. If your crystal ball, you're going to look out 3 years, 4 years from today, and organizations are obviously always interested in how do I manage to the future, from a data sovereignty perspective, based on our report findings, as well as your expertise in regards to what's transpiring in the market. What's going to happen with data sovereignty in 3 or 4 years? What should organizations anticipate so they can ensure that they have the right systems in place, the right technologies instituted?
Yeah, so I think there are two important points, right? So one, make sure that whatever you do, whatever you choose, you do not create a vendor lock-in. You want to be agile. New tools, new solutions, they will arise in the next couple of years claiming sovereignty, doing everything right, and you do not want to pick a solution that keeps you locked in. Make sure that you can move your data and your processes and your workflows to another tool, because the winner of today, certainly with all the agentic AI vibe coding happening nowadays, will not be the tool that will be the winner in 6 to 9 to 10 months. So keep your agility and keep your data in your own control. That's one. And then B, please make sure that you do not trust a vendor by saying they are sovereign. In practice, you are responsible. Supply chain management also in NIS2 and DORA is extremely important. Make sure that you are in control. Do not trust, quote, quote, your vendors by their blue eyes or by what they are saying. Validate that they are as sovereign as you want them to be according to your framework, while keeping agile. Those two components need to go hand in hand.
Great suggestions. Well, Rick, it's always a thrill to talk to you. Thanks for coming back to another Kitecast episode. We're going to have you on again. We'll figure out another topic for you to talk about: AI, data privacy,
or some email security market guide.
Precisely. We can talk about that based on your experience. I think we need a survey report on that topic, probably, don't we?
Exactly. So again, happy to be here. Looking forward to the next time, Patrick. Always a pleasure.
Absolutely. And thanks for our audience for joining another Kitecast episode. Check out other episodes at kiteworks.com/Kitecast.